What's up, everybody? Today, James and I are going to turn back the clock and grade picks 1 through 16 in the first round of the 2023 NFL Draft. Make sure you guys are subscribed to our YouTube at A to Z Sports Film Room, as well on Instagram at A to Z Sports Film Room, and make sure you're following us on Twitter at A to Z Sports NFL. The football room is now open.
Welcome back, everybody. The football room is now open. The 2024 NFL Draft is in the rearview mirror, but we are still ready to talk all things NFL and the NFL Draft. And we're gonna hit the little rewind in this episode. But before that, my name is Destin Adams. I am an Indianapolis Colts beat writer and NFL Draft analyst at A to Z Sports. And joining me, as always, is the man with the plan on this channel, James Foster. James, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm going to have to try to record through these cicadas today, so that'll be fun.
Hey, it's that time of year. I feel like the cicadas are probably where you are in Tennessee, so to the point that like whoever's listening, they'll probably have it where they're at too, so it'll just feel like they're a part of the show. Yeah, exactly. So thank you, cicadas, today. This episode is brought to you by cicadas, apparently. But like I said earlier, we are going to hit the rewind button for this show, and we're going to be looking at the 2023 NFL Draft. We are going to be breaking down the first-round draft picks and how they've worked out for their teams over the next two episodes. Today, we'll be covering picks 1 to 16 from last year's draft, and the next episode, we'll hit 17 through 32. So last year's draft class, a lot of impactful players, a lot of players that went in day one and made really big impacts for their teams. This first person, though, James, I'll go ahead and just get my thoughts out there first. Bryce Young to the Carolina Panthers. I think there's a lot of things to consider when looking at the Bryce Young situation. First of all, let's get the elephant out of the room. Yes, they took Bryce Young over C.J. Stroud last year. The second part of this is how much they gave up to get Bryce Young. Caleb Williams is in a Bear uniform pretty much strictly because they made the decision to trade up for Bryce Young. So when I'm going through to try to grade this pick, like I don't want to crucify it because there was a lot of teams that had Bryce Young as their number one quarterback in last year's draft. There was a lot of people in the NFL draft space that had Bryce Young as their number one quarterback. I wasn't one of those. I wasn't one of those people. I was pretty high on C.J. Stroud last year. Not to toot my own horn on that. There's a lot of people that had that as well. But I'm going to give the Bryce Young pick a C-. I still think the Panthers did something that a lot of teams wish they could do, and they go up and get their guy. There's no question that they took the player they thought was the best quarterback on the board in their decision makers' minds. I think going for the right position, I think there was still some good things that we saw down the stretch last year with Bryce Young as well. After the last staff was let go, we have a new coaching staff, a new offensive staff coming in. So I'm not ready to kick Bryce Young down the road, call it a bust pick, but a C- to me says they took the right position, didn't take the right player. With a couple quarterbacks, if we did a redraft right now, I think Bryce Young would probably be the third quarterback off the board at best. And I think for that reason, I got to go C-.
Yeah, so I just for a peek behind the curtains, Destin sent me his grades so that I could make a graphic, but I didn't change my grades at all. But I can tell that I am a much tougher grader just as far as the scale. I kind of spread it out a little bit more. So I went with a D for Bryce Young, although I think it sounds like we feel pretty similarly about his rookie season. I think that if the comparison point is, Bryce Young versus CJ Stroud, obviously it's a major disappointment because I think that CJ Stroud is going to be an elite quarterback for the foreseeable future. And I think that Bryce Young still has a chance to be a really good quarterback, but I feel like his lack of arm talent in some areas can kind of hold him back. Like you said, he finished really well down the stretch. The Packers game and I think the Falcons game were two of his more complete games, and those happened at the end of the season. There were a few kind of disaster games where he turned the ball over a bunch. it's tough with Bryce Young because his supporting cast was so bad in terms of receiver separation and offensive line protection. That has historically been an excuse that has been used to kind of cover for, not very good quarterbacks. And so, I understand that can be kind of a risky assessment to make, but I think that D for Bryce Young is fair. A pretty majorly disappointing season, but I think that there's still some hope there.
And I mean, Dave Canales got the most out of Baker Mayfield this past year. Now, I don't think it's a one for one comparison. I mean, I think both are a little bit smaller for the quarterback position. Obviously, I think Baker has shown a little bit more arm strength than we've probably seen from Bryce Young. But I am excited to see Dave Canales work with Bryce Young. But up next here, we have the Offensive Rookie of the Year, number 2 overall pick, who was a surprise on draft day last year. But obviously the Texans got it right. So, James, what are your thoughts on C.J. Stroud to the Texans at 2?
Yeah, I gave CJ Stroud an A plus, the only A plus from this draft class, at least from the first round. And he really showed everything that you want to see from a franchise quarterback outside of just having pinpoint accuracy. Like, I think, what did he throw? 26 and 5 or something, 26 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. He could have easily put up like in the 30s, way better stats if he was just more consistent with his ball placement. There were still a lot of missed opportunities on tape. Even with that, though, he was already one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. I think the most impressive, or I guess encouraging aspect of his tape is the ability that he showed out of structure. That includes outside of the pocket, but also just maneuvering within the pocket when the play breaks down. Basically, any question that you had about CJ Stroud's play extension ability to operate under pressure, heading into his evaluation, it's like, okay, if the Georgia game is the real CJ Stroud, then we're good, and that ended up being the case. Just got the arm talent, the natural accuracy and throwing motion, quick release. He's a good processor, can do stuff when the play breaks down. I think got to be extremely optimistic about CJ Stroud, and honestly view him as a top 5 quarterback going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to not give it an A plus. The Texans knocked it out of the park here. I think Stroud, like you said, has shown himself to be a guy that's going to be an elite quarterback going forward. I don't know if I have him in the top 5 quite yet, but I definitely think his outlook for the future is in that top 5 range of things. I think Stroud last year showed his ability on the field, and you covered a lot of that. But I think the impact of this is even larger than that, because I think the only quarterback that I can compare who has gone into a building and just completely flipped just the mindset of teammates and a franchise. The only one that comes to mind is when we saw Joe Burrow go to the Bengals, and we see like how his personality, his mindset, like that fire that he brings, like it was contagious throughout the Bengals locker room. And I feel like CJ Stroud has had that similar effect on Houston, a franchise that before this pick was in very deep downs over the last couple of seasons, obviously, and the morale just wasn't there. And for the morale to be such a flip there with Stroud, and obviously DeMeco Ryans coming in as head coach has an effect on that as well. But I think Stroud has been an A plus for the Texans on the field, and I think it's just as important to say how impactful he has been off the field for them and this franchise. We don't have to go far for pick 3, obviously, when the Texans trading up for Will Anderson Jr. This is another one where you're grading the player, but you're also grading like what they gave to do this, because obviously they give up some draft capital to come back up to 3 from 12 in last year's draft. I ended up giving this an A minus, defensive rookie of the year for Will Anderson Jr. to the Texans. They ended up giving up a future first, which obviously at the time they were crucified because they gave up their own first instead of the Browns first, and their first ended up being worse than the Browns first. I think getting rid of their first gave them that mindset to to no matter what the beginning of that season looked like last year, where it did look like it was going to be a rough year that first half of the year, that they really had nothing to lose in sense of going out and trying to win these games because they weren't playing for draft pick range because they didn't have their own pick. So in the end, I think it did help them motivation wise. I do still think that watching Will Anderson Jr. this last year, really impressive player. I think they did the perfect thing in going out and getting a Daniel Hunter to play opposite of him, just because I still have some question marks about if I think Will Anderson is going to develop into this alpha in an edge room and be that guy that leads your team in sacks for years and years to come. But putting a guy like Daniel Hunter next to him, I think is going to even open up more possibilities for him this next year. So I gave it an A minus, still a really, really solid pick. If this was them just taking him at their selection, it's probably an A plus.
Yeah, so I did the letter grades a little bit differently. I was more just grading the player and not really counting for the process of the pick. So I ended up going with an A for Will Anderson Jr. I think that he had, in a lot of ways, he was really steady throughout the season. In a lot of ways, he had kind of the opposite start and into the year. To start out, he was winning a lot as a pass rusher and like getting pressures and stuff, but he just wasn't able to convert them into sacks. I think he had one sack the first week and then went, 7 or 8 weeks without a sack. I remember doing a video where I was basically having to like explain and make the case that he's still an effective player, even though it hasn't translated to sacks. And then over the second half of the year, he starts racking them up. Like even some of them are just cleanup type of sacks, but still as effective, winning one-on-ones and getting to the quarterback. I think that for Will Anderson Jr., the main thing that's going to determine whether he's like a high-end number 2 or a true number 1 is just how good he can get with his hands and if he can continue to add moves to his pass rushing arsenal. There are some times where he's kind of just like either trying to run through you or trying to run around you, doesn't really have a way of defeating the hands. I think probably his worst pass rushing performance, you saw that play out against Anton Harrison for the Jags, where he was pretty much shut down. But a lot of games that he was able to take over, and even in the other games, just like a consistent presence in the backfield. So I went with an A for Will Anderson.
Hey, I think all of that makes sense, and especially like if you're just grading the player and not like the process of things. And like he said, we didn't really talk about that beforehand when building the episode. You just get to see live how we interpreted the topic of the show. So that'll be a fun part of this episode for sure. Up next is at 4, the Indianapolis Colts stay put. They selected quarterback Anthony Richardson. Didn't get to see much of him last year, James, but what are your thoughts on the Colts selection of Anthony Richardson a year removed?
Yeah, so a tough player to put a letter grade to when they barely play at all. If anything, I would just give them an incomplete. I did go with B minus, but it's like I could kind of see being higher on him than that. I think Anthony Richardson's a player that I was really high on as a prospect. I think he has so much upside. And he comes in and it's like I'm sort of counting off for him some mistakes that he made that other quarterbacks had an opportunity to like bounce back from, because he played basically 2 games, because he played the Jags game, then he plays the Rams game, and then he had a half in the Texans game and a half in the Titans game. So like 3 games in total. And in those 3 games, you saw some misses, you saw some accuracy issues that we saw in college. There were a couple bad decisions, like the interception in the flat against Jacksonville kind of stands out. But then you also saw, number 1, the elite rushing ability. You saw the incredible arm talent. The Rams game especially, like he made some insane throws. His ability to step up in the pocket, avoid pressure, and then access like all of his arm strength with just the flick of a wrist, not have a clean platform to step into. That touchdown was at Mo Alley Cox, where he's like jumping in the air. That's the one that always sticks out to me with Anthony Richardson. So it's like I view him as a prospect that I think has a lot of upside, and that I'm really excited to see how he develops. As far as putting together any kind of complete performance, I don't really think he did that. But in a lot of ways, I feel similarly about Anthony Richardson as I do Will Levis, where it's like I think they have a ton of upside, wide range of outcomes, and I'm excited to see how they develop heading into year 2.
Yeah, I mean, Anthony Richardson, like you hit it on the head with like it feels like a guy we wish we could put an incomplete or an NA on. We didn't do that for anybody. We graded each pick as we could. I gave this an A, and the reason for it being I think if we did a redraft of the 2023 draft, which maybe me and James do down the road, if we did a redraft, I feel like he's gone by now. Like I feel like if you redraft this class, it probably goes Stroud at 1, and you probably go Richardson at 2 or 3 to the Texans if we keep them in the.
If I'm redrafting the quarterbacks, just my personal opinion, I would go Stroud, Richardson, Levis, Bryce Young. That's the order I would take them.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could go Levis or Young in any order. It's probably they're very different styles of quarterbacks. First of all, so it's probably very dependent on who you're going to. Like for the Colts, if the Colts are going to be where the third quarterback comes off the board, which obviously that's the thought process of it, I think Levis comes off before Young. I 100% agree. But like that's why I feel like I have to give it an A, just because I think he flashed a lot. Like you said, we didn't get to see a lot of it, and I think the big part is like, yeah, the mistakes were there. It's just when you only play 3 games, I mean, Stroud had struggled a little bit more earlier than he did later in the season when he was like lighting it up. Like we didn't get to see Richardson go, and I feel like the big one is like we saw in that second half and that comeback against the Rams. Like I feel like we saw some things start to click in Richardson as a passer. Like we saw in the Texans game, like this kid could be special as a runner, right? Like that first half was setting up to be like a special type of performance.
And as a passer, because he threw a bunch of like I was watching that game last night. He threw like he had the 2 rushing touchdowns or whatever, but then he threw a bunch of like 3rd and 10 conversions that his receivers dropped. So like I think he was impressive in both phases.
But like that Texans game was a big one. Then I feel like the Rams game in the first half, we saw some of those rookie struggles, and then that second half, like we saw the bounce back live. Like we saw what this guy can do even when he's down. And I think enough flashed that, like I said, I think he'd be the second quarterback off the board. I think the Colts would do this pick 10 times out of 10 again. It's just about staying healthy. This next season will be big. They have a little bit more juice on the offensive side this next year. So I'm excited to kind of see what they do with that, with a guy like A.D. Mitchell they drafted this past year, and seeing some guys take some next steps like a Josh Downs, who had a pretty successful rookie year that I don't think gets talked about enough, honestly, with a quarterback that wasn't going to utilize his full skill set. So I gave Richardson an A, but I would understand anywhere from that B- to A range with this, just because it's such a hard guy to grade with such little impact that he was able to have in such a small window. But up next at 5, the Seattle Seahawks take Devin Witherspoon. I ended up giving this a B+ for corner. I think Devin Witherspoon's a great player. I think he's going to be a really successful player in this league as well. The reason I don't put this in the A range is I just feel like there was a missed opportunity here for the Seahawks to go get a guy like Jalen Carter, who was on the board still. And we saw how dominant Carter could be this last year. The Eagles may have gotten it wrong the year before when they took a defensive tackle from Georgia, but I think Jalen Carter righted that wrong pretty quickly. I think Carter is a dominant force on the interior, and I feel like him at 5 to Seattle would have made it to where they wouldn't have to have traded for a Leonard Williams. They wouldn't have had to do some of the things they did on the interior instead. And I know they end up drafting Byron Murphy this year on the interior as well. And I think Jalen Carter would have just filled a need. I think Devin Witherspoon's a good player, but we still saw their secondary struggle mightily last year, even with him, to where I think the better player available is kind of what knocks us down for me. I think Devin Witherspoon is an aggressive style of corner. I think he's still going to be a guy that receivers hate playing against. And he's just going to annoy them all game long. And I think he's going to be a good pro. So I went with a B+.
Yeah, I went with an A for Devin Witherspoon. I think he was one of the best rookies from this past season. Really, the one thing that's keeping him out of the A+ range is just that his job was a little bit easier than some other outside corners. He's playing a lot in the slot with a lot of underneath zone coverage responsibilities. So he's kind of like, a glorified safety in a lot of ways. He played outside and inside, but like he wasn't given as many deep coverage responsibilities. And when he did have those one-on-one opportunities down the field, you see him give up the touchdown to CD Lamb, gave up a touchdown to Brandon Ayuk. There were some rookie struggles, but like overall, this dude broke up probably 14 passes when you combine like forcing completions and pass breakups. He got sacks, pressures, really effective blitzer, one of the best run defending corners in the NFL. I just think like the energy that he brings to their defense on top of his talent, I think is worth taking in the top 5, even in a redraft. If I didn't really factor in like who else was available on the board or anything, I get the argument that maybe they still should have taken Jalen Carter. But if the haul is Devin Witherspoon and Byron Murphy, I'm good with that. I think Devin Witherspoon has a really bright future.
Hey, I get it, like the player. Another guy that I wouldn't argue an A whatsoever for. Up next here from the Arizona Cardinals, who moved around a lot last year to end up at pick 6, tackle Paris Johnson Jr. What are your thoughts on that pick?
Yeah, I went with a B for Paris Johnson Jr. So we'll get into Darnell Wright in a little bit, but I think Darnell Wright would have been the best rookie offensive lineman that was taken in the first round. I think Paris Johnson Jr. is probably the one that I feel most optimistic about their upside. Because if we're just purely judging their output and what they were able to do as rookies, I think Darnell Wright's tape was a little bit cleaner. Paris Johnson Jr. had some losses, some more rough moments, but the upside that he showed as far as movement skills, like there's no one I think in this class that gets depth in their pass sets as effortlessly as Paris Johnson Jr. He's got 36 something inch arms, but unlike a lot of those longer tackles that we see, he's actually pretty good with his hands. He's still got to refine the placement a little bit. And he's got kind of an issue where I've got really detailed thoughts on him on my mind because I was just recording his film breakdown, but he's got an issue where he starts out with a really wide like hand carriage. He's got his inside hand basically like covered over the B gap. So then when people try to hit him with power, when he's got to try to clinch up and get his hands inside, it's such a long path that his hands have to travel. And that gave him a lot of issues last year of just letting people in his frame. So there's technical stuff that he needs to work on, but I think Paris Johnson Jr., like I was really high on him, had him as a top 5 player, ends up going 6 overall. I don't think the Cardinals are regretting that decision. And he also, I think, had his best performances, it felt like back to back the last 4 to 5 weeks of the season.
Yeah, I mean, Paris Johnson, again, I factored a lot of the trades that had to go down more so than James did, so that's going to change things for us. But to go from 3 to 6, and obviously there were some other moves in that. They went from 3 to 12, from 12 up to 6. But in the long scheme of things, they dropped from 3 to 6, took the player that many believe they would have taken at 3. The word out there is that they loved Paris, and that was out before the draft even started. So that mindset is still there for me. And they end up getting a future first to drop back those 3 picks. Again, there was more movement than that, so it's not exactly that, but that's how it ended up. I gave him a B+. I think Paris had a really solid rookie season. The Cardinals' offense last year was so sporadic with integrating Kyler Murray back into the situation. The passing game wasn't something they relied on heavily last year as a result of that. I think this next year you select Marvin Harrison in the first round. Kyler is going to have a full off season of getting back to full strength. I think the hope will be that they enter next season and being able to hit the road running. And I think a guy like Paris Johnson, who is so solid in the passing game already, like I think we'll be able to see a lot more from him this year. And I agree. I don't think this is a pick they regret at all. So I went with a B+. Here at 7, we go to the other side of the ball, but still in the trenches. The Las Vegas Raiders take Tyree Wilson, edge rusher. This pick was puzzling at the time. Felt like a high upside reach a little bit. Still feels that way after an up and down rookie season, but I feel like this pick was always about years 3 to 5 of that rookie contract and not 1 to 2. So I'm still going D plus. I'm not going to cut it down too much here. I know James is a little bit lower than I am here in a second, but I still think Tyree Wilson, his athletic build, his frame, I think there's still things that can be utilized and coached up to work well. The new coaching staff in Vegas, I'm hoping gets the most out of him, but I still think he might be 2 years away from seeing what this pick even is. But because of that, another guy that I would love to give an incomplete on, just because I don't feel like we've seen what Tyree Wilson is yet or what they view him as yet. But I went with a D plus because it was still a reach at the time.
Yeah, I ended up going with an F, and like it's really not trying to be a hater, but so I went through, I think, his last 8 games of the season yesterday, and there was, when I'm going through these players, I'm like pulling clips, good and bad, to use in a video, and like I had one play in the Tyree Wilson like good play folder. I didn't think there were flashes last year in either phase. It started out, I know, and I'll get to his first half of the season eventually. It started out, I know there were issues with him being laid off the snap. I saw some Raiders like writers that I follow that were questioning, motor and stuff. I didn't notice that as an issue when I was going through his tape. He at least like runs to the football and stuff, but he just has no idea what he's doing as a pass rusher. He like even just spatial awareness of where other blockers are. Like he'll get around the left tackle and then just trip over the guard. Like he doesn't like know where the offensive players are aligned. Doesn't really have moves that he can, put to memory and repeat. And talk about like moving him inside. They played him at 3 technique a lot to end the season. I didn't think that really unlocked him or anything. So I went with F just because I think that at this point I would be surprised if he ends up being like a high quality starter. And I think he's the only player that I could really say that for in the top half of this first round. And maybe if we're scaling it, like D minus is probably the better grade, because Isaiah Wilson would be the F grade as just a rookie that gives you absolutely nothing. At least Tyree Wilson played, but I just thought when he played, it was not very impressive tape.
Yeah, definitely a lot of room to grow there, and we'll have to see what this next season looks like for Tyree Wilson and the new look Raiders. Going to the other side of the ball, the Falcons take Bijan Robinson at pick 8. What are your thoughts of a running back in the top 10?
So not a pick that I would make. My philosophy is that if you do one of these things like picking a running back in the first round, I'll criticize the pick then, but I'm not just going to, for the rest of his career, say, well, Bijan, shouldn't have been drafted as high, even if he ends up being a really good player. I'm just kind of looking at him as a player now. So I went with a B minus. I think that there were some fumble issues down the stretch, but he showed that dynamic change of direction ability in the open field, the ability to cut. And then the Falcons always give us the coolest angles on Twitter, like during the week, where they have the sky view of it. So it makes it really nice to watch. But yeah, I think he didn't have crazy production from a fantasy football perspective. I don't necessarily blame the Falcons coaching staff that much for not wanting to run their first round pick into the ground. I think as his role continues to increase, I do think he'll end up being a really good running back. If you're evaluating the pick, again, that's not the pick that I would have made. I try not to be an annoying, running backs, don't draft running backs type of person, but that's not something that I think is great business. But just as a player, I think he showed some flashes, needs to get more consistent.
Yeah, I mean, I gave Bijan a C plus. I agree with a lot of things you just said. Taking a running back in the top 10 is just not something I would do. And I think Bijan could be a special level of player. Don't get me wrong. This is the last guy I get to say this about, but the Falcons had a perfect chance to go towards the defensive side of the ball and take a Jalen Carter at 8. It would have made sense at the time. It'd make a lot of sense now, looking at their roster. But Jalen Carter was there. Bijan Robinson, I think he's going to be a good player, but I went with a C plus. The positional value just isn't there for me. Pick 9. I went with an A for the Eagles with Jalen Carter. You guys have heard me talk about him twice already, so I feel like that shouldn't be a shock. I think Jalen Carter righted a lot of wrongs that we saw with the Eagles draft the earlier year from 2022. Jalen Carter was a day one impactful player. His strength is just very noticeable on tape, and he's going to continue to get better and be a foundational piece of this Eagles defense. I don't think there's much more to say there. I think it was a home run pick for the Eagles at 9.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of rookie defensive linemen come in and be that impactful immediately. I went with an A minus, but I I honestly think you could definitely argue an A. I bumped him down a little bit because I thought he was less effective as the season went on. Um, it, Especially in the first half of the year, it felt like he was kind of cleaning up on some bad offensive lines, and then as the competition level increased, he looked a little bit more human. But the bar for rookie defensive linemen is so low. That's just not a position that players come in and are immediately impactful. He's got that club swim that's really effective. Got a pretty good bull rush. Wasn't as consistent in the run game, but I think I think Jalen Carter is going to be one of the future elite pass rushing 3 techs in that Jeffrey Simmons to Quinnen Williams tier, I think is probably how I project him. And obviously like he could go even higher than that. So yeah, I went with an A minus. Totally see the argument for an A though.
Up next, a guy you've already mentioned today, pick 10, the Chicago Bears, after trading out of the number 1 pick last year, ended up with Tennessee tackle Darnell Wright.
So I went with a B for Darnell Wright. Like I said, I think purely his output and his production as a rookie, he was the best first round offensive lineman. I'm doing a lot of these first round rookie scouting reports, and kind of the main negative for a lot of players is just they need to get stronger. And Darnell Wright is one of the few players that I would not say that about. Like I didn't see him lose to power. He's got such a strong anchor that they didn't even really try to hit him with a bull rush that frequently. Just in the 330-pound range, and he moves his feet really well for a tackle of that size. He doesn't have quite the range of someone like Paris Johnson Jr., even Broderick Jones, who we'll get into, but enough to get the job done. And then what really ties it together is how skilled he is with his hands. He does a great job of, since he isn't this elite athlete, he doesn't put himself into compromising situations, and he does a good job of countering a lot of the moves that pass rushers try to throw at him. So I think the Bears have a future franchise right tackle. Went with a B just because, again, I've seen Tristan Wirfs' rookie season. Every other year, it seems like we get one of these tackles, Rashawn Slater, that comes in and is just immediately a top 10 tackle, for example. And Darnell Wright's still someone that had some growing pains, so just got to give the scale there. But I think that you got to feel really confident if you're a Bears fan about Darnell Wright.
Yeah, so I went with a B plus, which is funny because you give a lower grade on it. I think you're higher on Darnell Wright than I am as a whole. I go B plus for the pick. The reason that keeps it out of the A range for me is you kind of touched on it a little bit. I think Darnell Wright is pretty much pigeonholed as a right tackle. I don't think he's a guy that's going to switch to the left side of the ball. I'm also really interested to see how he does in pass protection with a quarterback like Caleb Williams, who does a lot of his work outside the pocket and does a lot of his work moving to either side of the direction that is going to make it to where Darnell Wright needs to move his feet a little bit more in pass protection off the snap than a normal right tackle might have to. But I think Darnell Wright as a right tackle did everything you want to see him do last year. I think you saw how strong this guy can be. You touched on that. I think he's a guy that's going to be very impactful in the run game. I'm really interested to see if the Bears lean on the actual running back running game a little bit more this next year with a quarterback that will look to pass the ball opposed to what we saw from Justin Fields over his time in Chicago. And that's not meant to be a shot at Justin, just an observation that the Bears really didn't need the running backs to take the lead in that rushing department. So I'm really interested to kind of see Darnell Wright get to excel there. So I went with a B plus. At 11, we have the Titans also going offensive line, and it was guard Peter Skoronski. I went with a B plus. I know the Titans messed around a little bit with guard and tackle during his rookie tenure. They had a lot of injuries, obviously, on that offensive line throughout the year. Obviously, that line also just wasn't good throughout the year as well. I hope and I believe with the new staff, they view Skoronski as strictly a guard. I think he can be really strong at that area. I think he was really solid. He probably was one of the most consistent pieces in this entire first round. Now, taking a guard in the top half of the first isn't for everybody, obviously. But I think at the time there was the flexibility questions of if he can play guard, if he can play tackle. So I understand the pick at the time. I went with a B plus just because I think Skoronski is going to be a key member of this line. There's probably a chance he's the best offensive lineman on the team this year, and I think a pretty high chance. So they get a tackle in 2023. So I like this pick of Peter Skoronski last year. So I went with a B plus.
Yeah, I went with a B minus. I think speaking of offensive linemen that need to get stronger, I think Peter Skoronski is the epitome of that.
He looks bigger. He looks bigger in OTAs and everything already.
Yeah, most of his losses came to just power, and there's also he had some issues where I think he takes his sets a little bit too aggressively, still adjusting, moving inside, and he'll overextend, especially with guys that are lined up on his inside shade. So there's some technical issues, I think, specifically with his footwork, but the main thing is just getting stronger, having a more consistent anchor. What makes me really confident in Peter Skoronski is how good he is with his hands and how athletic he is. I think that's a combination where if you can just get that play strength up to an adequate level, you're looking at least a starting quality guard. So I think that in terms of the long-term outlook for Peter Skoronski, it would shock me if he was a bust in any sense of the word. But the upside I do kind of question just because he had some pretty dominant losses last year that are kind of concerning, like the Texans game. I think the one at Houston was really concerning. Had some rough losses in the Steelers game, the Dolphins game. There's just some, I have some questions there. He could be a guy kind of like, I don't know, Charles Leno at tackle, who's like good snap after snap and then has one dominant loss every game. It seems like that could be kind of an outcome for him. But yeah, overall, I think it was a solid rookie season. Also got to mention that he had the appendix surgery. So especially, I know in the weeks immediately following that, you could tell that was affecting his play strength some. I know he lost some weight. But if you get Peter Skoronski with his technical polish and just a little bit stronger, I think you're looking at a really good starting guard.
At pick 12, the Lions, after a move back, select running back Jahmyr Gibbs.
So I went with a B plus, which I had a B minus for Bijan. I think that both of the running backs didn't necessarily hit the ground running from a playing time standpoint. And so I know there was some fantasy football disappointment with them, but I really think that Jahmyr Gibbs looked like arguably a more dynamic player than Bijan Robinson. I think that, if obviously the 1-2 punch with David Montgomery, I'm still in favor of doing that just to keep him fresh. But I think his ability to win angles around the corner, obviously make people miss an open space and, be a third down back, I think he'll be a key piece for their offense. And again, I wouldn't have gone with a first round running back, but if we're just grading the player for what they are, I think a B plus is where I'm going.
So I went with a C plus for Bijan. I'm going with a B minus for Jameer. I think you said a lot of the same things that I feel. I think Jameer showed that he can be a little bit more dynamic potentially than Bijan. The first step from Jameer, man, we saw it in his very first game last year, like what he can do with the ball if you give him the opportunities. I think Detroit, for taking a guy so high, staggered his playing time a little bit too much. I mean, I think David Montgomery should continue to be that goal line back, to where if you're a fantasy football person, you may hate it, but like I think that is the best way to go about it, because I think Jameer does so much to get you down there, and then let David Montgomery be that strong workhorse to get it into the end zone. But I went with a B minus, a little bit higher than Bijan, because the Lions reportedly considered taking him at 6. Ended up trading back from 6 to 12 to get him. I think if you're going to take a guy that you believe you're higher on in the consensus, trading back, getting picks to still take him at a little bit of a reach is just a better business model, in my opinion. So I think they played the board perfectly. At 13, we have the Green Bay Packers, who go Lucas Van Ness. I went with a C. My issues with Van Ness are going to be the same as they were this past year. I think Van Ness is a fine player, a high floor type of guy. I think we've seen what he's going to be to a lot of the extent. I think he's going to be really solid in the run game, can play on the edge, can play on the interior, so it gives you a little bit of positional flexibility. But I just don't think he's ever going to be a guy that wows you with production. I don't think he's ever going to be a guy that is one of the better contributing players on a good defense in the NFL. So Lucas Van Ness, fine player, just not somebody that I feel like is a difference maker. And at pick 13, it's just not the route I would have went.
Yeah, I totally agree with you based on what I've seen so far. So a few of these players, Tyree Wilson, Lucas Van Ness, and Will McDonald, I haven't watched their whole season, but yesterday I went through and for Van Ness, I think I watched like his last 7 or 8 games like I did with most of them. And it's kind of based on his level of competition. I feel like I want to be careful before I say anything like too negative about him, because these are the left tackles that Lucas Van Ness went up against in the games that I watched: Trent Williams, Tyron Smith, Christian Darrisaw, Tristan Wirfs, and Andrew Thomas. And he looked very ineffective, but that's what I would expect from most rookie edge rushers. So I do want to watch the start to his year and see if he was maybe better against some more average competition. But I see a player that's explosive, that has decent size. I would say probably good size. I mean, he's listed at 272. I felt like he was a little bit smaller than that on tape. He's not great with his hands at this point. He's still a developmental pass rusher. So all he really has in his bag right now is the bull rush. And he doesn't have that kind of overwhelming strength for that to win against better NFL offensive tackles. Maybe it'll work against, the guys that like the Titans were rolling out last year. But against the top guys, it was going pretty much nowhere. His one really highlight play, I thought, was in the Cowboys playoff game. It was actually an incredible play. If y'all want to go look it up, he gets like snatch trapped. Tyron Smith is trapping him, and he's like going face first, and he's probably a couple inches off the ground, and he gets this last second burst where he's like parallel with the ground, bursts up, dips underneath Tyron Smith, and gets a sack. It's a pretty awesome display of just like effort and hustle. But even his best plays come where he loses from a pass rushing standpoint. So yeah, like you said, I think you framed it pretty well. Like I don't really see a game changer or a super high impact player. I think he could be a rotational number 3 edge rusher, maybe a solid number 2. And probably not going to be a player. I think Joe Tryon, not from a skill set comparison, but just as far as how impactful they are. That's kind of how I see Lucas Van Ness. Not something that I think is worth taking at 13. So I went with C minus.
Pick 14 for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think this is the pick that we have the largest variance between our our grades.
Yep.
So the Steelers go with tackle Broderick Jones.
Yeah, so I went with a C for Broderick Jones, and I could see the argument for C plus. I think that he was probably the most inconsistent of the first round offensive linemen, and I mean that in a good and a bad way. I think his highs were really impressive. Like there's 2 to 3 reps on his tape of him doing whatever it is, whether it's like an outside hand strike, playing with independent hands, backside cutoff in the run game, down block, getting a lot of displacement, pulling and pancaking a linebacker, dropping his anchor. Like there's 2 or 3 reps where it looks exactly like you want it to look. And I think if you just took his highlights, I think they're probably, I would say, even more impressive than the highs from Paris Johnson Jr. this year. The problem that I have with Broderick Jones, just purely looking at his rookie season, is that I thought the lows were as low, or I think lower than anyone else. I mean, he had some true like disaster games where I felt like he was a real liability for the Steelers offense, especially down the stretch. The Bills game in the playoffs, like he kind of unlocked Von Miller for the first time in quite a while. I think we're going on 3 straight podcast episodes that I've mentioned Dio Odeyingbo, but he got a couple sacks on him in the Colts matchup, and Broderick Jones could have easily given up 5 or 6 sacks in that game. You know, Clowney was beating him with a cross chop a few times, but then there's also some games, like I said, where it looks perfect. I mean, I thought the Seahawks game was one of the best individual performances from any of these rookie tackles in both phases for Broderick Jones. So he's a player where I'm really excited about the upside. I think he has a chance to be as good as anyone in this class. But just grading the rookie season, I do have to go with a C because I think that he was at certain points the main weakness of their offense in specific games.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, I think this is the biggest variance we had. I went with an A minus for Broderick Jones. Um, I think the Pittsburgh Steelers had such a weird philosophy with their rookies last year. Both Broderick Jones and Joey Porter Jr. were clear as day, ready to start on that roster for the main part of being those were weaknesses on the Steelers team. Like there weren't corners that should have kept Joey Porter out of the starting rotation early in last season. There weren't tackles on the Steelers roster last year that should have kept Broderick Jones sitting for that first portion of the year. And tackles more so than maybe any offensive lineman, like the growing curve and that the rookie struggles, they happen with just about everyone. And I think you start Broderick Jones week 1, you get through a lot of these bumps and curves that you have to go through. And I think we would have seen a lot more of the flashes that we saw last year into the end of the year. I think I went with an A minus. I think the Steelers would do this pick again. I think Broderick Jones would probably go in a similar range in a redraft as well. I think the talent is there. They need impactful tackles. Obviously, they take another one this year as well. I wouldn't be shocked if Broderick Jones gets moved back to the left side now in this next line. I don't know if that's already been something that's came out with the Steelers. I apologize if it has. If you're watching, let us know in the comments if it has. But I think Broderick Jones on the left side, let Fontanu either play at guard, either move him over to the right side. Like I love that ability that they have now. And I think Broderick Jones is going to have a big second year. I like the upside with Broderick Jones, and I think it was the right pick for them.
Yeah, and that's one of those where again I would make the distinction between how I'm kind of grading the player
yeah.
instead of grading the pick. If I was grading the pick, like I think B it would be kind of the range that I would go, because it's like if you're drafting more of he's not really a project, but a developmental player. And then they struggle early. That's kind of what you expect in their rookie season. So yeah, that's my opinion on it. But I think that I am excited to see how he develops.
No, yeah, I get that for sure. Over to 15, another developmental player a little bit. Edge rusher Will McDonald, the fourth for the Jets. I thought McDonald last year was worthy of this level of pick. I know there was a difference of opinions there with him. I think the talent is there. This last year, the Jets had a lot of guys playing over him, and that was kind of known when the pick was made. Huff goes on to sign with the Eagles. They end up trading for Hassan Reddick, though. So that is still going to be an issue there. I went with a B just because I think the player has the talent. Now, the problem with the Jets and him is I don't know how soon he's going to be able to be a guy that is like starting on this team. Like for pick 15, you probably want an edge rusher to at least be in the starting consideration. I don't think he's there right now with the Jets roster. So I question if this is going to be a guy who has like a fifth-year pickup when his option's up for the table. But I still went with a B. I think the flashes were even there last year. He showed his ability to win off the edge. I think he's going to continue to be a solid player, but I do have questions about him with the Jets right now.
I'm with you as far as the pre-draft analysis of it. I think this was a pick that some people didn't really like. I thought it was appropriate value for what he was as a prospect. And, I got into his tape last night, and it's kind of tough to watch because he plays anywhere from 12 to 16 snaps per game. So you're just kind of hopping around, and he'll come in for a third down. He'll come in for a drive here and there. Having not really heard about him that much throughout the season, I didn't have super high expectations, but I was pleasantly surprised by the flashes that he showed on tape. Another one kind of like Anthony Richardson, where I don't know exactly how to assign a letter grade to a player that played so few snaps. C+ is kind of just my standing grade for like incomplete, basically. But he was the Bills game. I thought was probably his most one of the Bills games was one of his most impressive performances. But he showed some flashes against the Chargers, the Dolphins. He had this sack where he just ran the arc, really showed off the bend, his ability to get low and dip underneath the outside hand. I think that he also had some wins with his spin move. That's kind of his strategy as a rusher is speed rush, inside counter. But then the thing that with Will Anderson that I'm excited to see him unlock and kind of add to his game as he gets stronger is that he's got really long arms, and he has, with his first step, it's the perfect combination to have a really effective bull rush. He would try it some last year, and he's not really big enough to pull that off in the NFL yet. I also don't think he has quite the size or play strength to hold up as an early down edge rusher. So as he can add that'll really start to complete his game. But based on the opportunities he was given, I think it's fair to go with a B. I don't really even have any disagreements with that, even though I have a different grade. And like you said, they kind of got a log jam, so there's a chance that he might not be maximized in terms of usage, but I'm still pretty optimistic and excited for Will McDonald.
Yeah, we'll have to see how it works out there for him, but I like the player. Question the pick for them at 15 last year in sense of their roster, but can't change that. At pick 16, another one that was shocking to a lot of people last year. We have a year of seeing it now. Emmanuel Forbes, cornerback to the Washington Commanders.
So I went with a D- for Emmanuel Forbes. The one thing that's keeping him out of the F range is that I thought he had a couple nice performances later in the season after he got benched and then kind of reintroduced into the lineup. They were against, I know he had a really good game against the Patriots, which is, one of the worst receiving groups in the NFL. So kind of makes sense there. I think that he still has some upside as a corner that can be a ball hawk and make a lot of plays on the ball. I just think that at his size, there are real limitations and caps on what he can be when he gets matched up with an A.J. Brown caliber of receiver that has size, can win at the catch point, but also beat him as a route runner, beat him with speed. I worry about that. But then I also worry about his ability to hold up in the run game. One of the few, I think, saving graces of this pick at the time was that even though I thought it was an overdraft from a talent perspective, he was at least a scheme fit in Washington's defense with how much off coverage they play. And, he can just be someone with eyes on the quarterback, break on a bunch of passes, hopefully get interceptions. Now, if he's going to be playing more at the line of scrimmage, he's going to be asked to do a lot more in the run game. And he just, he can't hold up. He gets widened out to the sideline. He gets flattened in open space. Darnell Wright had a dominant rep on him as a puller. So I worry about his run defense. I worry about his ability to be physical in coverage. I think with his speed and his ball skills, he could still develop into kind of a boom bust, high volatility type of corner that's at least worth having on the field. But I'm not very confident in that happening.
Yeah, so I went with a C. I agree with a lot of the things you said. I'm excited to see the secondary staff and defensive staff that's being brought into Washington this year to utilize a player like Forbes. I mean, last year I think he was overdrafted. Let's just start there. I mean, Christian Gonzalez going after a Forbes was not on my bingo card last year. So it was definitely something I was very shocked about when pick 16 was announced. I'm interested to see what he can do in Dan Quinn's defense. I'm interested to see if that is on the outside, if that's in the slot. I'm just really interested in his skill set with Dan Quinn. So that's the saving grace here for me with Forbes and why I'm going to stick with a C and sticking out of the D range. I could watch this year and see a lot of the same and move it back to a D. So I am doing a little bit of predicting with Dan Quinn getting the most out of Forbes. But I do think it's a good setup for Forbes and his success this year. So we'll have to let it play out. But right now I'm going to stick with a C. This has been picks 1 through 16. Let us know in the comments which picks you think we got right, which picks we got wrong in terms of grades, and let us know your grades as well. Next episode, we'll be attacking picks 17 through 32. So if your team didn't get covered today, stay tuned next week. It will be here, I promise. This has been the Football Room, and we will be back next week.